It is the middle of the 13th century. Two armies are involved in a life-or-death struggle at the small Eastern European town of Legnica, in modern-day Poland. The Mongols, under the leadership of Orda Khan, grandson of the great Genghis Khan, have invaded Hungary and Poland in Eastern Europe. To oppose them, Duke Henry the Pious of Silesia has assembled a force of various nationalities, including a small detachment of Teutonic Knights sent by Pope Gregory IX. It is the first of three invasions of Eastern Europe by the Mongols. The Mongols depend on battle tactics made possible by their highly mobile cavalry. In order to defeat them, the Europeans will change their military from predominantly infantry to cavalry. These changes will have effects well beyond how European armies fight that no one could predict at the time. It is the use of a simple overlooked invention by both the Mongols and the Europeans at the Battle of Legnica, which leads to monumental changes in the conduct of warfare and the basic structure of European society, and makes April 9, 1241, a history in days.
This video is presented by History in Days. This channel will focus on how the events of a single day can change history in ways no one could predict at the time. We will be publishing a series of short, 10-minute videos for all 365 days of the year. If you like history from a different perspective, or are just curious about how and why events interconnect, please remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel. And to receive notices of our new videos, please also click on the bell. And we will see you in your history in days that follow.
The earliest civilizations recognized the advantages of speed and maneuverability on the battlefield. The first weapon designed to provide a mobility advantage was the chariot. It played a critical role in the first recorded battle in history between the two superpowers of the ancient world. Over 5,000 were employed by the armies of Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II and Muwatalus, king of the Hittites, as they fought to a bloody draw at the Battle of Kadesh in modern-day Syria in 1275 BC. Fast forward 1,000 years and witness the pitfalls of relying exclusively on slow-moving infantry units and static defenses, exposed by the tactics and strategies of Allied and German forces during World War I. Both sides became bogged down in interminable trench warfare, with no hope of victory for either. Only the invention of the tank, which brought mobility to the battlefield, broke the stalemate and added greatly to the eventual Allied triumph. Even today, modern tanks are a key component of effective, mobile warfare. Continuing the evolution of battlefield mobility, helicopters are now the ultimate statement of the power of maneuverability in warfare, first expressed by Pharaoh's chariots at Kadesh. However, in the centuries between the end of the use of war chariots and the introduction of mechanized armor, it was infantry that played the critical role on the battlefield and dominated the composition of armies. New infantry technologies and tactics led the way as warfare developed through the ages. From the simplest spearmen to the phalanx and on to the legion, it was the infantry battle commanders relied on to win the day. Cavalry simply lacked the power needed to be used for anything other than lighter duties such as scouting, rolling up an already defeated opponent, or terrorizing civilian populations. And so, the most powerful armies uniformly possessed large formations of infantry, with smaller detachments of cavalry in a supporting role, right up to the beginning of the Middle Ages. That changed rather abruptly when in the space of just 20 years in the early 1200s, the Mongols under Genghis Khan conquered Asia from the backs of their steppe ponies. Using new tactics, including mounted archers and feigned retreats, the Mongols introduced cavalry as the main force of their armies. The tactics and incredible successes the Mongols achieved were made possible, in large part, by the adoption and effective use of a simple invention: the stirrup. At the time of the Battle of Legnica in 1241, stirrups were not a new invention. In fact, there is evidence of a primitive, toe-loop stirrup in India, dating from 200 AD. But the Mongols were among the first to exploit the full potential of stirrups by integrating them into a revolutionary weapons system comprised of three additional components. First, the tree saddle. This type of saddle protected the back of the horse by evenly distributing the weight of the rider. A horse and rider using a tree saddle with stirrups could cover extraordinary distances much more rapidly than a column of infantry. The Mongols often surprised their enemies by arriving before they were expected, an incalculable advantage in any era of warfare. The second addition was the Mongol horse, or steppe pony. Although diminutive in stature, when compared to the larger horses of Europe, the Mongol steppe pony had incredible stamina and could survive on minimal forage. When paired with the tree saddle and the stirrup, it was the perfect engine of Mongol mobility. The last component was the adoption by Mongol cavalry of the recurved composite bow. Lightweight and small enough to use on horseback, it was nonetheless as powerful as the English longbow. It allowed a warrior on his steppe pony, riding a tree saddle with stirrups, to rain destruction on his enemies without giving them any opportunity to respond. Similar in effect to America's stealth aircraft, opposing forces suffered destruction before they could respond. And just like America's pilots, Mongol warriors were well trained and capable of taking full advantage of this weapon system's capabilities. This new form of warfare made the Mongols invincible for the first decades of the 13th century. And now, they were bringing their thirst for conquest to Europe. By the time of the Battle of Legnica, the Europeans had also begun to incorporate the stirrup into their cavalry units. But the widespread adoption of the stirrup in Europe would lead to the development of a much different type of weapon system than that of the Mongols. Without the vast, flat plains, or steppes, of Mongolian Asia as their primary battlefield, European military strategy emphasized raw power over ultra-mobility. They combined the stirrup with heavy armor and melee weapons. The mounted knight became the ultimate expression of European cavalry. While it retained its advantage in maneuverability over infantry, the cavalry of Europe was more akin to the heavy tanks of today, as opposed to the light, special forces characteristics embodied by Mongol cavalry. And so, April 9, 1241, was really a clash of two very different visions of how to make the highest use of the new capabilities of cavalry, made possible by the stirrup. But in ways no one could have predicted at the time, Legnica and the ensuing battles of the Mongolian invasion of Europe had effects far more profound than their outcomes. History had been made in a day. Now let's see what happened in the days that followed. The Battle of Legnica resulted in an overwhelming Mongol victory. The Mongols quickly pressed their advantage, and several additional victories followed in rapid succession. It must have seemed to the dismayed Europeans that their use of the stirrup to create heavy armored cavalry was proving inferior to the Mongols' ultra-mobile model. However, the Europeans were learning as they gained experience with the capabilities afforded by this new military weapon. The Mongol invasion of Europe was interrupted by the sudden death of their great Khan and the ensuing internal conflict over the throne of the immense empire. By the time they returned, they found a much different Europe was waiting for them. The Europeans had learned that their earlier defeats were primarily the result of poor organization and tactics. In reality, when used properly, their armored knights were more than a match for the lighter Mongol cavalry. But to be victorious over the Mongols, the Europeans needed one more addition to their weapon system. Led by King Bela IV of Hungary, the Europeans embarked on an extensive program of castle building. Combined with the mobility-limiting effects of the forests and mountains of the European terrain, the castles allowed the Europeans to dictate the time and place of any battles to those that favored their model of cavalry. The last Mongol invasion was halted and then thrown back. Suddenly, every king in Europe wanted lots of castles. And, of course, mounted knights. But knights and castles are expensive. The typical European king of the Middle Ages did not have the resources necessary to build, man, and maintain such prohibitively costly weapons and fortifications. So, what did they do? They made deals with their leading citizens. The kings of Europe bequeathed ownership of the land and the people living and working on it to the new nobility. In return, the noble dukes, barons and counts promised to provide the king with fully provisioned and paid-for armored, mounted knights, and to build castles in which to fortify them. The bigger the land grant, the grander the title, and the more knights and castles required to be financed for the king. This arrangement comes to be known as the feudal system. Those who work the land and pay the taxes that actually pay for the army of armored mounted cavalry and the castles to house them come to be known as serfs. It lasted for almost 500 years. And although it caused untold human misery and suffering, it contained the seeds of its own destruction and led to a positive transformation of Western civilization. The feudal system completely upended the structure of everyday life and the institutions of medieval Europe. Suddenly, everything revolved around the knights the stirrup had made possible and the support system needed to maintain them. The organization of every community centered on the castle, its fortifications, and the supply chain of food and material the serfs provided. Although this was, no doubt, a less than satisfactory arrangement for the serfs, they remained, for the most part, disorganized and powerless. But by instituting feudalism, the kings had unwittingly also created another, not so powerless class. Hundreds of nobles now existed. They had control of the land and the supply lines. Even worse for the monarch, the dukes and barons and counts he had created also controlled all the knights and castles. Indeed, the medieval map of Europe contained literally hundreds of baronies and dukedoms and counties, each ruled over by its very own noble, who had been created by the monarch but who now demanded that his or her prerogatives and rights be respected by everyone, including the king. And to make matters even worse from a despotic point of view, each of those nobles wanted education, exotic goods from merchants, a safe, secure dwelling for the family, and maybe a party every now and then. Equal justice under the law. Some even wanted religion. All of these wants and needs would lead to the formation of a strong middle class, demanding, no doubt, that it be heard as well. These nobles were not shy about demanding attention. What's more, if they did not get all they had coming to them, they submitted petitions or gathered in unlawful assemblies to discuss unlawful plots. They even had the impertinence to confront the king. The kings resisted their encroachments on royal power. But in the end, the nobles knew exactly where and how to hurt the king. They hit him right in the purse. If their requests for attention were ignored, if their demands went unmet, the nobles not only cut off the supply of castles and mounted knights, they instituted representative democracy, parliaments, to control the purse strings and turn off the flow of money to the monarch. And once the nobles had equal representation, it was not long before the teachers and the merchants, the lawyers and even the priests also demanded and got their fair share. Feudalism and serfdom came to an end, and Western Europe developed a tradition of elected representation and a strong middle class to support it. And that can at least partially be laid at the foot of the lowly stirrup. When it was used by both sides at the Battle of Legnica on April 9, 1241. A History in Days.